Hello, and welcome to the Citadel of Mycenae. I'm Dr. Rob Steffen, and here we are at one of the greatest Bronze Age sites in all the Greek world. Now, the site of Mycenae dates back to the second millennium, or the 1000s BC. And the Bronze Age more generally is the time period that we associate with the rise of civilization. So things like political and social hierarchies, economic specialization, the emergence of writing, monumental architecture like the walls you see here, and of course, the development of bronze. And the site of Mycenae is so important when it comes to all these things that we actually name kind of Bronze Age culture across mainland Greece after the site itself. We call it Mycenaean culture. This is also the time period that later Greek poets, so people like Homer, look back to as inspiration for their tales of warfare and adventure. So let's go ahead and start that adventure and journey with me as we investigate the Bronze Age citadel of Mycenae. Now, the origins of Mycenae are shrouded in mystery, but later Greek authors attributed the founding of the city to the Greek hero Perseus. And this gets back to the Greek word for mushroom, or Mycenae. And as the story goes, the hero Perseus either plucked a mushroom from the site right here, or dropped the cap of his sword, which was shaped like a mushroom and had the same name there. And hence the founding of the city and the name of the site, Mycenae. Now, the lineage of Perseus lasted for like 3 generations, and it culminated in the rule of King Eurystheus. Now, Eurystheus was the guy who actually commissioned Heracles to complete the 12 labors. After the death of Eurystheus, the rule of the site fell to a man named Atreus, who was actually the son of Pelops, the guy who founded the Olympic Games. Now, Atreus had a brother Thyestes, who was always jealous of his ability to rule the site here. And Thyestes plotted against Atreus, having an affair with his wife and deposing him from the throne. Atreus wasn't going to go quietly, though. And he came up with an agreement with his brother that if he could do this nearly impossible task by making the sun go backwards in the sky, right, from west to east, that he would once again be able to rule. And with the help of Helios, he's actually able to make this happen. But Atreus wasn't done yet. He then takes revenge on his brother by taking his 2 kids, chopping them up, and baking them into a pie. He then serves that pie to his brother Thyestes. So we've got a pretty messed up family here. Thyestes' one remaining son then does get revenge by killing Atreus. At that point, the rule of the site falls to Atreus' son Agamemnon, and he ends up marrying a woman named Clytemnestra. Agamemnon's brother is a guy by the name of Menelaus, and he ends up marrying Helen, who will become Helen of Troy, and Menelaus rules down at the city-state of Sparta. Now, spoiler alert here, right? The curse of the House of Atreus is not done yet. And it turns out that Clytemnestra actually ends up killing Agamemnon after his return from the city-state, or from the Trojan War. It then turns out that Clytemnestra's own kids, Orestes and Electra, kill her for revenge. And all this madness doesn't stop until Athena acquits Orestes of this matricide, saying that he was only doing the right thing, getting revenge for his father. Anyway, Agamemnon is the most famous kind of mytho-historical king of the site of Mycenae. And I want you to kind of keep in mind all this murder and betrayal and intrigue as we head inside the citadel. And as it turns out, right, we actually think that Homer was looking back to people like Agamemnon, sites like Mycenae, and the historical period of the late Bronze Age more generally, as he's conceptualizing and creating the stories that we see in the Iliad and the Odyssey of the Trojan War more broadly. So let's go check it out. Now, during the Bronze Age, armies got bigger and became professionalized. And weapons grew deadlier as they were created out of metal, right, out of bronze. And as a result, cities had to become more defensive in nature. So here you can see the defensive walls that would have surrounded the site of Mycenae. And when you look at the stones that are used to create these walls, These things are absolutely enormous, right? Larger than a person. In fact, according to legend, only a giant cyclops could move such a stone, and hence we call these cyclopean walls. Now you can also take note of the kind of narrow nature of the entranceway into the site here, okay? And this was so that defenders could sit atop the walls, fire down arrows, throw down boiling oil, whatever it took to keep out the invaders. Now, as we move towards the entryway, we can see one of the most famous sculptures, one of the most famous artifacts from the site of Mycenae. And that's this monumental sculpture of two Near Eastern style lions angled towards a central column. And that sculpture gives its name to the entryway here. We call this, for obvious reasons, the Lion's Gate. And in fact, this sculpture is the only monumental sculpture in all of mainland Bronze Age Greece. Now, it doesn't just play a decorative function. It's not just there for looks. This also serves a very practical function, and that's because it's lighter in terms of weight than the surrounding stones. So this actually relieves some of the weight that's sitting on top of the lintel, right? The stone above the doorway here. It also played a key role in the identification of the site itself. So, 1,500 years after the site was built, after the Lion's Gate sculpture was created, the Greco-Roman traveler Pausanias in the 1st, 2nd century AD wrote about it. He traveled to Mycenae. It was a tourist attraction in his time, and he wrote about seeing the Lion's Gate sculpture. Then, 1,500 years after that, in about 1700 AD, the Venetian governor of the region decided that he wanted to check things out, see what was in the landscape, and his survey crew, reading Pausanias, right, a text written 1,500 years before their own time, came across the exact same sculpture. So it's kind of amazing that a site built back in the Bronze Age still has its sculpture in place 1,500 years later when the Greeks and Romans could write about it. And then 1,500 years after that, it was still in place so that a Venetian survey crew could use it to identify this as the site of Mycenae. So let's go ahead and head through the Lion's Gate and check out the citadel itself. Now, one of the earliest excavators at the site of Mycenae was a guy by the name of Heinrich Schliemann, a German archaeologist working in the late 19th century. Now, Schliemann was famous for discovering some of the most famous Bronze Age sites in all of ancient Greece. He was renowned to have gone around with a copy of Homer in one hand and a trowel in the other. And he's most famous for discovering the site of Troy, right? Home of the Trojan War, all the way across the Aegean in modern-day Turkey. Now, while Schliemann was very well renowned for his discoveries, his methods left a little something to be desired. So he was famous for taking all the jewelry he'd find from a site, dressing up his wife in that jewelry, and then doing photo shoots. Honestly, not exactly how we do archaeology today. Nevertheless, here at Mycenae in the late 1800s, Schliemann excavated what we're looking at here, which is known as Grave Circle A. And what you can imagine in antiquity would be a series of shaft tombs. And what that means is like small entranceways, right, that would go straight down into the ground and then open up into the chambers that you see below. And within those chambers are some of the most fabulous artifacts in all of Greek archaeology. So you've got golden burial masks, you've got bronze daggers inlaid with electrum, scenes of like lion hunts on those daggers. And then you've got hordes and hordes of gold jewelry. Something like 30 pounds of gold jewelry was found right here in this site. Now, the most famous artifact that comes from Grave Circle A is known as the Mask of Agamemnon, right? The supposed burial mask of the most famous kind of mytho-historical king of the site of Mycenae. But we know that even if Agamemnon was a real person, and even if the Trojan War was a real thing, that this was almost certainly not his burial mask. And that's because the date of Grave Circle A here goes all the way back to the 16th century, the 1500s BC. And Agamemnon, again, if he was real, would have been about 3 centuries later, somewhere around 1200 BC. Nevertheless, when you guys go to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, you absolutely have to check out the finds from Grave Circle A at Mycenae. They will undoubtedly blow your mind. So now we're up here further towards the center of the citadel of Mycenae. And as we look down on the hilly slopes inside the walls, we can see that they're covered in archaeological ruins. And these ruins would have contained a diversity of types of structures. So everything from storerooms to pottery workshops to olive presses for making oil to the housing remains of the Mycenaean aristocracy. And what you get a sense for is just how self-sufficient the population inside the walls of Mycenae could be, and how in times of invasion they could hold out for quite a long time and be just fine, at least if you were part of the Mycenaean elite. Now, the other thing that all these storerooms give us a sense for, when we combine them with another sort of artifact, these written tablets in the Linear B language, we get a sense for the economic nature of both Mycenae and the surrounding countryside. Now, those tablets are sort of like accounting documents, and what they do is they record different objects coming into the citadel from the countryside and then going back out to the population of the countryside. And what we can learn from this is that this was a relatively redistributive style of economy. Now, what this allows for is a level of economic specialization. And here's what I mean by that, right? So say you're living out there in the countryside where all those olive groves are, and your land is just perfect for growing olive trees. Well, in a redistributive economy, you can grow only olive trees. And you send part of those olives and the oil into the citadel here, and then you get a diversity of items in return. You can get your wine, you can get some meat, you can get some grain, whatever you need to live a happy and healthy life. And let's say that you're living way over there, right, in the mountains where it's great for herding sheep, but not so good for growing plants. Well, you can just herd sheep, send some of that meat into the center, and get your olives and your oil and your wine and your grain in return. And what this allows for, right, is for the land to be used in the way that is most optimal and suitable for the land itself. And that creates kind of greater economic output than if each little area had to grow all the different individual things that they needed. And this marks a kind of major contrast from the preceding Neolithic period, where that's exactly what would have happened, right? Each family would have had their plot, they would have grown all the different things that they need. By specializing, like they would have here at Mycenae and at other Bronze Age centers throughout the Greek world, we get a much improved economic output, and the kind of economic well-being of the population inside the walls and in the surrounding countryside would have been significantly greater. Now we finally made it to the very top of the citadel at Mycenae. And what you're looking at just below me right here, this was the palace, the political and administrative and economic and military hub. It's where the king, in Bronze Age Greek known as the Wanax, would have ruled not just the citadel that we're looking at here, but the entire surrounding countryside, perhaps as far as the mountains in the distance. Now, in terms of palace architecture, the Bronze Age palaces were centered on a room known as the megaron. And the central feature of this room was a huge hearth with a kind of eternally burning flame. And surrounding the hearth, you would get 4 columns, which would hold up the roof, and then there would be a hole in the roof for the smoke to escape. And it's in the megaron that I want you to kind of picture Agamemnon, right? The great king of the Homeric Iliad, ruling the countryside, receiving visitors from other Greek Bronze Age citadels like Pylos and Tiryns, the Minoan city-state of Knossos, or even the great empires of the Levant and Near East. And so as you have that in mind, picture him ruling his kingdom from the citadel of Mycenae as far as the eye can see. Now we've made our way to the kind of far other side of the citadel of Mycenae, and what we're looking at behind me here is known as the North Gate. It was actually a much later extension than what we get on the other southern part of the site, but it served a crucial purpose. After this region was constructed in the 13th century BC, it served as the way in which water would come into the site. So it would flow in from here, and then in the buildings surrounding here, as we look over to my left over here, these could have served as cisterns to gather that water. And once again, this serves as a crucial function, especially in times of invasion, so that you're able to have everything you need, food, water, everything. And you don't have to go beyond the walls and risk kind of the exposure to the enemy. So here we are in the far northern quadrant of the citadel of Mycenae. And this was actually a much later addition. It was built in the 13th century, the 1200s BC, centuries after the rest of the site. Nonetheless, it's of crucial importance to the survival of the population inside the walls. And that's because what you're looking at down here is an underground cistern. It would have been in this northern portion of the site that fresh water would have flowed into the citadel, and they would have stored it down here underground. And this is of vast importance because when the city was being besieged, having fresh water is what would have allowed the population of Mycenae to continue to hold out and to not have to expose themselves to the invading army outside of the Cyclopean walls. Now here we are outside the walls of Mycenae, down below the slopes of the citadel itself. And where I am right now is the entranceway to what's known as the tomb of Clytemnestra, the wife and murderer of King Agamemnon. And it might not surprise you to know that her lover's tomb, Aegisthus, that's right next door. And the father of Agamemnon, Atreus, well, the treasury of Atreus, that's located across the street. Now this gives us a great chance to talk about the architecture of Bronze Age tholos tombs. And a tholos itself refers to the chamber, circular in nature, covered by a dome on the top. The entranceway, where we are right now, is known as the dromos, or passageway, a very long passageway that leads to that doorway right there. That's known in Greek as the stomion, and it's covered by a relieving triangle. So that triangle up there, it's not just for looks. What it does is it actually takes the weight off of the lintels, the thing covering the doorway, and distributes it to the side walls where it's better supported. So let's go ahead and go inside the tholos tomb of Clytemnestra. Now we enter inside the tholos tomb of Clytemnestra. And as you look around, you can get a sense for why we call this a beehive tomb in English, right? Just look around you, look above you. Now it's cylindrical or circular in nature, and it goes all the way up to a somewhat pointed dome at the top. But this isn't a true dome. You see, a true dome would have a single keystone that would distribute the weight to the sides or walls of the chamber. Instead, this is what's called corbelled vaulting. And what that means is that each successive course of stone is laid slightly more towards the interior until a single capstone can sit on top of it, covering the chamber of the tomb. Now, I know this tomb has stood for like 3,000 years, but I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here before I become a permanent part of the archaeological record. Here we are now in the entranceway of a tholos tomb down outside the walls of Mycenae. But this isn't just any tholos tomb. This is the biggest, baddest, best preserved tholos tomb in all the ancient Greek world. And for that reason, it gets the name the Treasury of Atreus, or the Tomb of Agamemnon. Archaeologists really like to give mythological sounding names to these super impressive monuments. And this particular tomb has really stood the test of time. So 1,500 years after it was built in around 1300 BC, well, the Greco-Roman traveler Pausanias, going around Greece in the 1st, 2nd century AD, he could still visit the tomb here. It was a tourist attraction even in his own time. In 1700 years after that, Heinrich Schliemann, the excavator of Mycenae, well, he could still see the tomb as well. So even though the House of Atreus is one of the most cursed in all of Greek mythology, its legacy has one of the longest lasting legacies, both in literature and, as you can see here, also in archaeology. Now, sometime around 1200 BC, the citadel of Mycenae was burned to the ground. Not even its cyclopean walls could save it for all of eternity. This was part of a much wider set of destruction across the Mediterranean and Near East. And we call that the Bronze Age collapse, and it took place in the 12th century or 1100s BC, a fairly narrow band of time. On the mainland, we get Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos all collapsing. In the islands, the palace of Minos at Knossos is burned to the ground. And in the Near East, in modern-day Turkey, we get the collapse of both Troy, being destroyed several times, and then also Hattusa, the Hittite capital. Now, scholars think that if there's any truth to the Trojan War, that it likely took place during this period of kind of widespread warfare and destruction. And they've debated the causes that underlie how this could happen in such a diversity of places. Early on, scholars attributed it to something known as the Sea Peoples, a diverse group of naval marauders that were meant to go about the Mediterranean laying siege to even the most powerful citadels and cities and states. More recently, however, scholars have suggested a more multifaceted set of reasons that could have caused collapse in so many different places. So not just external invasions, but also internal rebellions, drought, famine, climate change, natural disasters, all those sorts of things. And what this would have led to is a breakdown of economic networks. So now no longer is this long distance trade, this redistributive economy set within or centered on palaces like Mycenae. And this led to poorer burials. It led to kind of less sophisticated art. It led to the collapse of the palace system. And it led to people forgetting how to write for something like 400 years. But when writing did come back, it did so in the form of Homer and his epic Iliad and Odyssey, which reached all the way back to the days of Mycenae and to the legendary kings like Agamemnon. So as you look around and you recall the Bronze Age days of kings and heroes, do so, and in doing so, you may let their legends live on for another 3,000 years.